Welcome back to the Best Worst Thing podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Lewa. My next guest is an award-winning author of 4 books, including his most recent book, Inaugural Ballers, the true story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team. His books focus on sports, history, and social issues, and they're just so fascinating. And his interest in writing really started at an early age. It's really a career that's bloomed to gain him some national attention, and even a documentary made after one of his books. He comes from a long line of prolific writers, which has continued to give him a chance to carry on that legacy of writing good works and telling great stories. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt University in American History, he spent time as a media relations manager with the Tampa Bay Devil Rays before a long career in public relations, contributing for ESPN, and then returning to Vanderbilt as the director for special projects in their athletics department. Welcome, Andrew Maraniss.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So, I appreciate you coming on to share your story, and I'm always excited about the big question at the end about like the best worst thing, but let's just kind of jump in from the beginning. I was fascinated about some of the work that you've done, and if you could share with the audience a little bit about kind of that your role as an author, and also how does that fit into your life at Vanderbilt University, and how do you kind of go in and out, and how do they kind of maybe even cross over with each other?
Yeah, it's a good question because I do feel like I live sort of 2 separate lives in a way, but they do intersect quite a bit. And they tend to revolve around Vanderbilt, which you mentioned. So my life as an author really began in coming back to a paper that I had written as a college student when I was 19 years old. I attended Vanderbilt on a sports writing scholarship, which is unusual. There's no journalism program at Vanderbilt, but there's a long line of sports writers who have come through the university going back to Grantland Rice in the early 1900s. He's the one that said it's not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game. And so this is a scholarship that's named after him and another man named Fred Russell. And I had applied for this when I was in high school in Austin, Texas, and played baseball, and was sports editor of our paper in high school, and was lucky enough to win this scholarship. And so I come here to Nashville as a kid that was interested in sports and writing and was a history major. And I was taking a Black history course my sophomore year. And it would happen to be the same time that a man named Perry Wallace was invited back to campus for the very first time to be honored as essentially the Jackie Robinson figure of the SEC. He was the first Black basketball player at Vanderbilt and in the entire conference. And there had been this resistance to telling his story on campus by administrators and fans that didn't want to deal with the racism that he had endured during his time as a student. And so finally, 2 decades later, he's invited back. And I happened to be taking this course on Black history and was interested in sports. And so I wanted to write a paper about Perry. And I was concerned that my professor would say that, we don't write about basketball players in college. That's not serious enough academics. But thankfully, Dr. Jones said, sure, if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should do. And so I wrote a paper. I called Perry from my dorm, spent 2 hours talking to him just out of the blue. He was generous with his time. And learning about his experience and having a chance to write about it, I felt was the most interesting thing that I did as a student in college. And it never left my mind. You mentioned I worked for 5 years at Vandy and then a year with the Tampa Bay Rays, came back to Nashville, was working at this PR firm, and had a career, but I wasn't really feeling like I was doing what I was meant to do, and coming back and 17 years later, telling Perry, hey, do you remember me? I'm a kid who wrote a paper about you. I'd like to write a biography about you. And he said, sure, if you want to try, go for it. And so I spent 8 years working on this book and sort of discovered a purpose in life, was, using my interest in sports and history and social issues is something that I could continue to do through books. And so all of my books since then have dealt with racism or anti-Semitism, homophobia, sexism, trying to tell stories that, can hook a reader through sports and then bring them something more than they imagined. And part of what I do at Vanderbilt now, back in the athletic department, is manage a program called the Sports and Society Initiative, which looks at issues like sports and race and sports and gender, sports and sexuality. And so in a way, I'm able to combine what I really love to do, personally through my books and professionally through my job in the athletic department at Vanderbilt.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's I'm struck by a couple of things, and I want to get to the most recent book, especially because it really hits on some of those topics, and I'd love to kind of get a understanding of your approach to that process. But before we go there, so you're 19 and you reach out to Perry Wallace. How did you get the boldness to make a? Because I feel like as a early college student, that's a pretty bold move. Where does that come from, or what were you thinking? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't think I thought of it as being bold. I think that probably my experience in even just high school journalism, or college journalism, and internships in the summer at the newspaper in Austin, Texas, gave me some comfort level with the idea that if you're interested in something, you can call somebody and ask them questions, and write an article. In this case, write a paper. And so I didn't think about it in terms of like, I don't have permission to do this, or he might not want to talk to me. I was probably a little bit naive also. And I benefited from Perry being very generous and willing to tell his story, especially me coming from an environment that had treated him poorly. I wasn't there 20 years earlier, but he could have said, I'm done with Vanderbilt. Why do I want to talk to this kid that I don't even know? But part of his philosophy on what made his experience worthwhile as a pioneer, even though there was a tremendous toll to pioneering, was that it was only worth it if people benefited from it, And so he was a teacher, he was a law professor, and teaching was part of his whole being, And so I think he was eager, or at least willing, to teach, through me, to a new generation of students.
That's very inspirational. That's very moving. I appreciate you sharing that kind of extra layer that not a lot of people would probably readily get access to.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned kind of discovering your passion around writing and taking these stories around sports, but telling a bigger story, connecting it to some really important social issues and other things. And so I'm kind of curious about as you look back to you as a kid, as a young person, a young adult, and then now, how does passion play a place in the work that you currently do as an author, and also to working with Vanderbilt?
When as a kid, I don't know that I had a real conception of sports beyond the field, or beyond the court, but was fortunate to follow some teams that would just grab you, and to develop that passion for sports. So I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the early 80s when Georgetown basketball was like the best in the country, right? And we had season tickets during that Patrick Ewing era of Georgetown basketball. So like, how could you not fall in love with that? My favorite baseball team was the Milwaukee Brewers. They went to the World Series when I was 12 years old. And so I've been hooked forever as far as that goes. But my parents also were very interested in politics and the world. My grandparents were too, and teaching lessons related to sports. They knew that's how they could talk to me, and I would pay attention. So I think my parents say I learned how to read by reading the back of baseball cards. My grandfather was a journalist, but he was also a very socially progressive person who went to one of Jackie Robinson's first games, drove from Detroit to Chicago to see him play. He was obviously a white person that had served in World War II with the all-black unit in the Pacific, and came back from the war, like invested in civil rights after his experience. My dad would tell me, like, we don't root for the Red Sox in our family because they were the last team to desegregate. So like those were messages that I was getting as a young kid. And I think when I saw this opportunity to write about Perry, it just sort of seemed like, well, here's a story about my new school that involves sports and racism, which I know my whole family's interested in, So to me, it felt like, I've got to do this. And then the experience of learning from Perry, who was a brilliant person. He was an engineering student at Vanderbilt, went on to law school at Columbia University. He worked for Ron Brown at the National Urban League. He talked about the concept of many mentors and mini mentors, and Perry just soaked up as much knowledge as he could from everybody he was around. So when he was a student at Vanderbilt, he met Fannie Lou Hamer and Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. And, you might have only had 10 or 15 minutes when they came to meet with a group of students, but he soaked it up. He did the same thing with Ron Brown and Bayard Rustin, and so he was I was just listening, to what he had learned from these really smart, pivotal people. And it took me 8 years to write the book, which at times was really frustrating, and I'm sure Perry wondered, is this guy ever going to finish? But on the other hand, it allowed me to get to know Perry even better over 8 years. And there couldn't have been a better teacher on not just like racism from a textbook standpoint, but being that he was 19, 20 years old, experiencing the worst of it, as an athlete in the Deep South in the late 1960s, and then throughout his career, even as a highly educated professor that you might expect would be treated well by people, but wasn't, and so he was able to look at himself from the outside, and see how he was perceived by other people, which made it even more valuable for me in listening to him to understand how it felt for him, how other people are making these judgments. And so I don't know if this gets to your question, but it really, learning from Perry, it just like sort of lifted me up in so many ways of understanding. And he made me feel like I was a worthy student, too. And so that gave me confidence that, hey, this is something that I can spend some time on and might be of service to people somehow in telling these stories. And so that's what gave me this sense of a mission. In his case, it was racism and the toll of pioneering that became something that I could try to tell. My second book, Games of Deception, is about the Holocaust, but through the eyes of, or the lens of, the first U.S. men's Olympic basketball team, which played at the 36 Olympics. And I was reading about the history of basketball, but also the Holocaust. And so Elie Wiesel was somebody that I was reading a lot about. And he talked about this concept when he would talk to his students. He would say, that he himself had been a witness to fascism and to the Holocaust, and that his students, by the nature of just hearing his stories and listening and learning, that they became witnesses too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like that was what was happening. Hopefully, if you want to put the best face on it, with Perry, he was the witness, then I was becoming a witness to tell the story. And that's what I want to do with all my books, is sort of remove the stigma that nonfiction is boring, for kids, but really you're telling a living history, and that then the readers become witnesses also, and hopefully use that to have a context for what we're seeing in the world now that is so the echoes are way too strong, in stories about racism and anti-Semitism and fascism and homophobia. And so I hope that these history stories are really relevant, and that's what gives me the passion.
That's great. Yeah, I love the idea of being the original witness, or a person being the original witness, but their willingness to share spreads the story, spreads the learning, spreads the growth, and hope, and in the best sense, advances us, because we can learn so much from so many of those experiences throughout our history. And on top of that, again, just you mentioned, the naive sense of, I just thought I would just go and ask because of journalism in high school, and you just go and you ask for the story. And I really do wish that a lot of us would maintain that level of naivete, I guess, in the sense of making bold moves and being willing to connect and learn and in those areas that we're really interested in. So I wanted to talk about Inaugural Ballers. This sounds like it's a really fascinating story, and I was kind of reading a little bit about the impetus for this book. But would you mind sharing a little bit more about your most recent book?
Sure. It's Inaugural Ballers. It's a story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team, and these women played at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. I mentioned one of my earlier books was about the first men's Olympic team 40 years earlier in 36 in Berlin, and half of that team, the men's team, came from the state of Kansas, from a small town called McPherson, Kansas. And so I did a lot of research out there, and when the book came out, I spoke at a lot of schools, middle schools and high schools, and the University of Kansas, about that story. And I was visiting DeSoto Middle School, Lexington Trails Middle School in DeSoto, Kansas, to talk about this book. And an 8th grade girl raised her hand and said, well, this is great about the first men's team, but what's the story of the first women's team? And so standing there on the stage that day, I realized, well, that's a book that I should write, especially as I realized that you could set the story in the context of the women's rights movement of the 1970s, and that if I finished it in time, it could come out in 2022, which would be the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And so there would be natural interest in women's sports and the growth of women's sports over the last 50 years. And so that's what gave me the impetus to write it. But I also realized that, this year on the 50th anniversary, there's been a lot of talk about the gains made over these last 50 years, but also the big story is the unfinished business, and the inequities that still remain. And one of the inequities is in terms of media coverage of women's sports. And you could say that books are, in the sense they're part of media, that I had actually been a part of, or an illustration of the problem. I had written 3 books, but none of them had been about women's sports yet. And so it was important to me personally to do what I could to elevate stories of these amazing women that played on that team.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting self-discovery motivated by the question of a middle school kid, right?
Yeah.
And I was having a conversation with one of my former students here, who's taken on a director role out in California, and he's a young guy, 30 years old, and so my mind, that's young.
Yeah, me too.
And he says, I want to learn from everybody. I want to learn from the adults, the directors. I want to learn from the kids. And I said, yeah, it's, I've had that kind of mindset throughout my career where I'm like, I'm not going to ever close the door to where I can expand and grow. And it sounds like she really inspired you to tell a story. And then the other learning is there's this large inequity in coverage in media, whether it's in books or whether it's in popular media. And to be able to see that within yourself and say, okay, I can actually write the course, or at least do my part, is pretty amazing.
Well, yeah, that idea of doing your part, like, I feel like everybody should be doing their part. Maybe you shouldn't use words like should, but like everyone could do their part if they chose to. And I think that that's important in the world. And the thing that I feel like I can do is write these stories. Some people would run for office or start a nonprofit or get really involved in a neighborhood or, different ways to do your part. For me, it's trying to tell these stories and then hopefully that they have some impact, through multiplication of a lot of people reading them, especially young people. And the idea of learning from young people, I think we would all benefit from that, and in terms of books and ideas, they're the most open generation probably right now, where you look at people my age or older trying to ban books about these types of subjects around the country, where the kids don't want them banned. They want these stories,
Yes.
And so I have a lot of respect for young people, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. This concept and idea of doing your part, a lot of, no doubt the last couple of years have been, really challenging in a lot of different ways for people. People have lost family and to the pandemic, there's wars going on, there's hate. And then there's also been some really positive experiences for folks as well. But for those folks who are going through that struggle, I think there's this search for being a contribution. Like, what's the whole point of this? Where do I fit into this whole life experience and world? And it's just great that you found a way to do your part through writing, and it's kind of taken a variety of roles and a variety of roads in between. I just wish that would be my wish for everybody is that they could find what it is that they're interested in, where they're at, that they're maybe have either a skill towards or have an interest or a curiosity around, and find a way to give back to the world through that thing. It doesn't, like you mentioned, like it could be writing, but it could be, playing sports, or it could be teaching, or even in business. But finding a ways to be a contribution is something that's benefits everybody else, but it really benefits you as an individual.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. And I know part of your mission with your podcast is sort of like career journeys and like mistakes or lessons learned along the way and hard points along the way. And for me, like one of the pivotal turning points in my life was deciding to try to be an author, where when I was at the public relations firm, I had been there for 18 years. It was a great place. I met my wife there, met a lot of friends there. And it was a good job, like a career track type of job that paid well. But I eventually had to come to a point of realizing that it wasn't healthy for me, literally in terms of my mental health, and our family life. We wouldn't have made it, if I had stayed there. But to realize that writing was what I was really sort of meant to do, and telling these stories, and to try to find a way to carve out the ability to do that while still being able to pay the mortgage. I haven't reached a point where I'm living with 2 kids and a wife, off my books. Very few authors actually can just be full-time authors. So I was fortunate through relationships that I had at my alma mater, which were strengthened by that book about Perry Wallace, Strong Inside, which brought me back to campus quite a bit, to have some relationships and track record that I could call on to come back to Vanderbilt, work for half the salary, but have the ability to write books, which is more of a common thing when you're on a university campus,
Yes.
as opposed to working in the corporate world. And so thankfully my wife was supportive of that, and we were able to try to figure out a way to do it. But in some ways it allows me to feel more fulfilled and like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. On the other way, it added a lot of stress because less money, and trying to produce, like, you don't just snap your fingers and write a book. Like, it takes a lot of effort to do it. You never know if your next one's going to be any good, or if anyone will buy it, or if you'll get published again, and so it's not like it was just all easy for everybody involved, but it definitely feels more like what I'm supposed to be doing.
Thank you for sharing that. I have 2 more questions before we'll take a little break, and then we'll get into the big question. The first question is about your writing process. You talked, as you transition back to, this other role, and like you say, you're not in a place where, you can do this and throw everything to the side, and most authors aren't. But you have to have a process. And for anybody who's interested in getting into writing, regardless of the subject matter, if maybe you could just talk a little bit about your process as you approach a project. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. Well, for me, some people would like to write about well-known subjects or well-known people. And for me, I tend to look for stories that really haven't been written about that much. So research is a huge, huge component to it. I think it's the most important part of writing nonfiction, even more than your ability, like, to write a good, interesting sentence, is the ability to really do the work on the research. And so I typically spend at least half, if not more than half of my time on a book is involved with the research, which will involve lots of interviews, lots of archival research, looking through old microfilm or digitized newspapers, reading a lot of other books that are related to the subject, traveling to the places where events occurred so you can just feel it. I'll tend to even try to trick myself that I'm back in those times that I'm writing about by listening to a radio station maybe that plays all 60s music, or watching movies from a certain era, or popular books that came out around the time, that the figures in my books are existing. Because I want the reader to feel like they've been taken back, time traveling back to these times. Then organization is really important, which doesn't come easily for me. If you looked at my closet, or my car or my office, you'd be like, this guy is totally unorganized. But for a book, I have to be. And so I usually create a 1-page outline of the very brief of how the whole book will unfold, and then have much deeper outlines for each individual chapter. In some cases, those outlines could be as long as the whole chapter turns out to be. But that way I know, like, where my material is coming from. Every sentence has to be drawn from some research you've done, so that organization is really important. And then, of course, the writing. I don't have like a cabin in the woods, I usually have my son sitting on my shoulders or something when I'm trying to write. And I'll do it before work or after work or on the weekends. I don't golf or have some time-consuming hobby like that. Yeah. So my hobby is working on the books. And then the thing that I think I've gotten better at is the edits and revision process, which I think, like a lot of students, probably hate that part. Yeah. And think I should have gotten it right the first time, and I did get it right the first time, and who is this person to tell me I could have done it better? I love that comma, I'm not getting rid of it. And so now I try to think of it more as coaching, that why wouldn't you listen to a coach help you try to be better at your baseball swing, or the way you're throwing the ball? So my wife or my parents or my editor, these are the people that typically read my stuff. They're just trying to help, so I know that that's part of the process. It's not extra. It's not like it shouldn't be happening if I had just done it right the first time. Like, it's just part of the process, and to accept it, not get personal or defensive about it. And when the book comes out, no one knows that great line came from somebody else's imagination, right? Or that there's a chapter that isn't there anymore because someone felt like it doesn't belong. And I've ultimately agreed with them. You want to have the very best product you can in the end, and the revisions are a piece of that. So that's really the process I go through. And then the other thing I've learned is that the process doesn't end there. So once the book comes out, at least in my experience, and I think this is true for even like best-selling authors, a lot of the publicity, the marketing is pushed back onto the author. There's not, your publisher is not doing it all for you, and so if you want people to read what you've invested your life in, you really have to get out there and find opportunities to spread the word about your book.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for walking us through that. And I was just taking notes about kind of each step. And, you really kind of lay it out in a process that works for you. And I'm sure, will work for other people who just don't even know where to begin in this whole experience.
Mm-hmm. That's the most important thing, is just starting. Like, I think one of the reasons it took me 8 years to write the book is that, 4 years of that, this is strong inside. My other books have only taken a year and a half, was a lack of confidence that I could do it, and so it could almost be a crutch to say, oh, I need to keep doing more research, because then you don't have you haven't proven yourself on writing anything yet, and that can be easier. So a lot of people say they'd like to write a book and then don't do it. And so my advice is just do it, even if, first of all, be realistic about it. Like, most books don't sell that many copies, right? But if you're choosing something that really matters to you, it's going to be worthwhile anyway. If you have the time and the capacity to do it, like, just the process of it is a valuable life experience, and don't rob yourself of that experience by worrying about things that are way down the road. Just get started.
That's great. Just get started. I think that's fantastic advice. Also, the other thing that stood out for me is the editing process, because I feel like in any field that you're in, you're going to get feedback, whether you want it or not, whether it's a annual review of your performance, or if you're an artist and, maybe you're a playwright and someone's critiquing you in a more public fashion. But in your process, you build in a place where you have to listen, you have to take the feedback. And I wrote down, you don't take it personal, right? I can imagine when it's your baby, you've been working on something for so long, and you've kind of really worked and toiled on it. And then someone comes back and says, yeah, you see this whole block of information, hit delete on it. I mean, it has to be, I'm sure maybe at other points in your life, it could have been soul crushing, but
yes. Well, it's definitely easier said than done. But I think I actually have gotten better at just accepting it,
Yes.
Instead of resisting it, just accept it. And you might not change everything that someone has suggested, but if you respect the people that you've asked to weigh in on your work, then, you'd be stupid not to listen. And so I've just sort of gradually come to this more peaceful place of just accepting it, and not taking it personally.
Yeah, I think there's something there, Andrew. There's like a proxy for life, where if you have good people around you who are honest, right, and you respect them, and then you should seek, if you're, depending on whether it's work or personal, seeking feedback. And even if you don't necessarily agree with it, your willingness to accept, because people do have a different vantage point, right? They have a different view. They're sitting at a different angle looking at something, and it ultimately makes things better. Maybe it makes your performance better, whether it's your leadership or your writing in this case. And so I love that idea that, even if it's not necessarily easy, you kind of breathe and just get to the acceptance place.
Yes.
Because you'll ultimately get a better product. I'm sure you look back at a line and be like, my line was better. But,
for sure.
But I'm sure.
No, I mean, there's still a headline that I wrote for the school paper in college that my editor made me change, and I haven't gotten over that.
We all got those. Our version of that.
Yeah.
All right. Before we get to the big question, I just want to ask a question. As I did research on you and learned more about your background, you mentioned, your grandfather was a writer and your father was a very successful writer. And you also lived in various places, I think DC and Austin, Texas, and others. Would you mind just giving us kind of a rundown of whatever you want to share about your background growing up and anything else you want to share about your family and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So I was born in Madison, Wisconsin. My parents were 20 years old. They were students at the University of Wisconsin. And so I felt like I was always sort of just tagging along with them. My sister was born 4 years later, but very close with my parents. My dad was a journalist, and he wanted to try to make it on the East Coast, right? So when I was 5 years old, we moved to Trenton, New Jersey, and he took a job with the Trenton Times, which was owned by the Washington Post and was treated sort of like their farm team. They would have young reporters there that they would call up to the big paper if they could prove it. So that happened. He started at the Washington Post in 1976 or 7 when I was 6 or 7 years old. And so I grew up in DC and grew up around, that great newspaper and would tag along. And I remember going up to the Metro desk, or seeing Bob Woodward in his office, or I would go by the sports department. And back then they would have these AP wire photos that would print out, and they would put them in folders in case they ever needed them for a story. So there was a Milwaukee Brewers folder, which was empty because I stole all the pictures out of it when I was a little kid. Yeah. The Post at that time had a bureau in Austin, Texas. And so my parents said, let's try something new for a while. So my dad was the bureau chief for the Post in Texas. That's where I went to high school, was in Austin. So, I mean, in terms of exposure to writing, it was always there with newspapers. My dad's written 12 or 13 books now, but he didn't write any until I had graduated from college. So it was more journalism and journalists that I was around as a kid. And I don't know, I just felt like that, to me, it was like not thinking about it, but just the idea of writing, or in the best sense of journalism, looking for the truth, or exposing hypocrisies, or people that were abusing their power, that just sort of came with it, and so I saw that example every day.
That's great. Yeah, it's clear that, I know that others have captured this, and I know you've captured the influence of his work and their work, but also too, it was not necessarily just their direct work. It sounds like just the environments that you were in gave you a lot of opportunity for exposure and exploration, and gave you an opportunity to really explore that, including, your work in high school, I think, working on, did you work for your school newspaper, or was that what it was?
Yeah, I worked for the school newspaper when I was in high school. And then every summer when I would come back from Vanderbilt, I would work at the Austin American-Statesman newspaper as their summer intern. And it was a great experience. A lot of the journalists, that's when they would take their vacation. So I had a chance to cover the Dallas Cowboys training camp, or be sent out to some small town in Texas and write about a high school rodeo competition. And I mean, I knew nothing about rodeo. It was put into some environments like sink or swim type environments. I remember when the Houston Astros were bought by a new owner, they sent me to the town where he had his company, to go interview him. And looking back on it, I was just wearing shorts and high tops, walking into this, huge corporation, and just without announcing that I was coming, can I interview the CEO? You're asking about the courage to call Perry. I definitely benefited from just being young and dumb, and thinking this is what they told me to do, so I'm going to do it. But it was fantastic experience for sure.
That's great. That's great. I appreciate that. Well, we're going to take a real brief break, and then we'll get into the big question. So Andrew, of course, this podcast being called the best worst thing. It's we ask our guests to kind of a little bit more elaborate on that difficult thing. So it's the what, the how, and the what. So it's what was your best worst thing? How did you kind of work through that thing? And then kind of what were the lessons you've learned that you took along with you going through that? Maybe that the listeners can take away as well. It could be personal, professional, or anything else. So Andrew, what is your best worst thing?
I think in my life, the best worst things have been career changes, which at the time felt very scary and dangerous, and that I was losing ground or making mistakes that were really going to cost me in life, and recognizing that those were actually the best things that could have happened. I think a lot of young people, the fact is that people now change careers quite a bit, but I don't think that you normally come into your career when you're just getting started thinking that that's going to be the case, and I heard someone say that not to think of it as a career ladder, but a career river, and that it might change directions and weave around a little bit, but that's fine. You're headed where you're supposed to go. And so you mentioned I worked for the Tampa Bay Rays. At the time, I thought that was my dream job. But I was only there for 1 year because I realized it wasn't, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I had really wanted to work in Major League Baseball since I realized I wasn't good enough to play Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
So since high school, that's what I wanted to do. And in college, I applied to every team. I got rejected by every team, but I would save those rejection letters because they looked cool to me with the team logos and my name on it, and finally there was a new expansion team, two teams in 98, the Diamondbacks and the Rays. And I was hired by the Rays, moved down there, had a long distance relationship that was also involved at the time that was not working. And so that year in some ways was a dream to be in the major leagues, but a nightmare personally. And so I quit after a year and moved back to Nashville. And there were a lot of people that were like, how could you quit working for a Major League Baseball team? And that caused me a lot of self-doubt and disappointment, but in coming back to Nashville, I ended up meeting my wife now, and building a great family. Coming back to Nashville allowed me to eventually write that story on Perry Wallace, and to discover a life as an author, which never would have happened otherwise. And so even though there are a lot of pain and tears and a loss of confidence in quitting what I thought was a dream job, ultimately it turned out to be the best possible thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I connect with that so much in my career, and I'm sure others do too, where you make a move that, where you walk away from something that to everybody else looks like the obvious right thing, but for you, it's really, really challenging. When I saw, the Devil Rays on your kind of your rundown of things that you did, I thought to myself like, whoa, he made it to the big leagues, right? Like you got that dream job. But what I've learned personally, and it sounds like what you learned early on is, from the outside, it may be the thing that you want, but when you get there, sometimes it's something different. And the willingness to be brave and to say, I'm going to walk away from this thing, even if other people on the outside are going to say like, what kind of a move is that? Even if you're going to kind of second guess yourself. You mentioned earlier, like as you kind of also change roles, sometimes you take a lateral move, or even in your current role, like stepping away from corporate world and taking half the salary, it could really play a game on your head. But my personal experience is when you find something that you really enjoy and that provides you space and time, the rest of it will take care of itself. It'll catch up, right? That part of it, there's no doubt, will catch up. But the quality of life is so much better.
Right. Yeah. And that's been the best reason to do this. When I look around at my family,
yes,
and I'm a better person, a happier person, and that we have this time together. That's what makes me feel like it was worth it. And you want to try to match how you're feeling inside with what's happening around you externally as much as you can. And what I think I've noticed over the years, when those two things don't match, is when you're really unhappiest, even if to other people on the outside it looks like you've got it together. You know, you know that whether that's true or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a psychological term or therapeutic term called congruence or incongruence, right? Like when the inside is not matching up the outside. The inside wants something else, but the outside of what you're actually doing is totally different, and you're off. You're unbalanced. And to be able to match those things up, and in your case, gave you an opportunity to write this book, meet your wife,
right?
You know, and to be able to have a family and to be able to have all these really great experiences. And I think that's what happens when you're in alignment, which is fantastic.
Okay. Very cool.
Thank you. All right. So, you know, if listeners want to learn more about you, kind of find access to your books, what's the best way for them to kind of get connected or stay connected with you?
Okay. So the simplest way, probably just go to my website, which is just my name, andrewmaraniss.com. And Maraniss is Maraniss. I'm also some people might say addicted to Twitter.
Okay.
So you can find me on Twitter at TrueBlue24, which is a nod to the Milwaukee Brewers, the True Blue Brew Crew. So it's TRUBLU24 on Twitter. Although I don't know with Elon Musk buying Twitter, how long I'll be on there.
Recent news there.
Yeah. Those are the two best ways. And then the books, you know, they're at bookstores, or you can find them online if you prefer to buy books online. And there's audio and e-versions of most of those books as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking time with me this afternoon.
All right, Josh, this was my pleasure. This was a really interesting interview. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Best Worst Thing podcast. I'm your host, Josh Olewa. Music is produced by Josh One. You can follow him at Boomnote on Instagram and Twitter, and Josh One on Spotify. Our episodes are edited by Cooled Jets Music. You can follow him at Cooled Jets Music on Instagram. Our marketing is designed by Francesca Daniels. You can find her at FrankandKitty24 on Instagram. And our overall design is by Inspired Design with Ryan Daniels. You can find them at getinspired.design on Instagram. Thank you for listening to The Best Worst Thing.
This one's for the